Greetings and welcome. We are back in room 303 and Junior English. We now turn in your hymnals to page 784, 785 and following. Wallace Stevens' classic of modern poetry is the title of the text. We're going to turn now to the work of Stevens. I just want to pause for a moment though and let's do a real quick kind of mini history of poetry, shall we? It's fascinating to me the number of students who will say to me that they hate poetry, which I find a really compelling observation. And of course, part of this is probably what they're really saying is not that they hate poetry, but they hate the study of poetry. Can we say this out loud? Because any time you get in your vehicle and you turn on music, if that music's got lyrics, that's poetry. Do you know what I'm saying? Right? And if you go to a funeral and somebody pulls out a sacred text and starts reading like the 23rd Psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," that is poetry, right? Okay? And so I think that maybe when people tell me they hate poetry, what they maybe are really trying to tell me is they hate the study of poetry, the way that people try to dissect it and try to understand it and tell them what they're supposed to see in it and all that kind of stuff. Well, those kinds of comments I think are legitimate to at least talk real quickly about the history of poetry. So let's do this in about 1 minute, all right? Here we go. The history of poetry. Poetry is actually the very first kinds of literature that we know of in most cultures. Okay? It usually starts out, write this down, as oral. That is to say, long before it's written, it's spoken. In the Western tradition, of course, the most famous poems are epic poems. Homer's Iliad, Homer's Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. Those are the three classic poems of the Western culture. These all share in common a couple of things. Let's list them. 1, they are long. 2, they tell a story. They are what we call narratives. Okay, they narrate a story. By the Renaissance, all right, we begin to have a major shift in poetry. And poetry starts to become increasingly lyric. Lyric. By that we mean what? 2 things. 1, emphasis on its length, it's shorter, okay? 2, its message is less about telling a story and more about trying to capture an emotion of a kind. Of course, during the Renaissance, the most significant form is the 14-line offering we call a sonnet. We think of Shakespeare as a classic example here, okay? Then poetry starts to kind of go through from about 1600 on. Poetry starts to go through a very interesting evolution. We often will think that poetry receives its first major kick in the door moment with Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, okay? The famous deathbed edition of 1792, okay? Once Whitman publishes Leaves of Grass, poetry starts to look increasingly less closed and more open. Now let's write that down. What do we mean by that? Closed forms of poetry are very intentional forms of poetry. Rule-bound, we might say. Open forms of poetry, like free verse, that Walt Whitman will play the game with, now have fewer rules. It's not that there's not rules involved, it's that the rules are not so systematically enforced. All right? By the age that we are calling in American literature modernity, poets are starting to move out of, right, the old arcane kind of closed form understandings of poetry into more open forms of poetry. However, almost all the poets that were studied from Whitman on very well understood the old traditional epic poems. But one of the things that happens in modernity, and we saw this with Ezra Pound's A Few Don'ts, is that poets begin to ask questions about what makes a poem, what constitutes a poem. We are now going to look at 3 poems in order. One by Wallace Stevens will be where we will begin, then one by Archibald MacLeish, and finally we'll look at the Mary Ann Moore offering poetry. All 3 of these poems share in common the following. I would write this down. All 3 of these poems share in common the simple question, what is a poem? And why is a poem? And what's the point of poetry? Okay? Now, this is an old question. Percy Bysshe Shelley, the great British Romantic poet, wrote a famous poetic essay called Defensive Poetry, where he asked the same question. We'll turn now to Wallace Stevens on 785. You can see his dates there, 1879 to 1955. Let's read a little bit about Wallace Stevens, shall we? Wallace Stevens believed that the goal of poetry is to capture the interaction between the private, subjective world of the mind and reality. He spent his career writing poems that delve into the imagination and the ways it shapes our perception of the physical world. He uses elaborate imagery and precise language to express his philosophic themes. Stevens depended largely on the natural world for his inspiration because nature, he said, is the only certainty. The next heading, Insurance Executive by Day. Stevens was born and raised in Reading, Pennsylvania. After completing his education at Harvard University, he took a job at an insurance company in Hartford, Connecticut, and eventually became the company's vice president. He did not publish his first collection of poetry, Harmonium, 1923, until he was 43 years old. In Harmonium and much of his other work, Stevens uses dazzling imagery to capture the beauty of the physical world while expressing the dependence of that beauty on the perspectives, on the perceptions of the observer. Although the book received little public attention, it was praised by critics and launched Stevens' literary career. Stevens published many volumes of poetry, The Ideas of Order in 35, Parts of a World in 42, Transport to Summer in 47, The Auroras of Autumn 1950. His collected poems earned him the Pulitzer Prize in 1955. Despite his success as a poet, however, Stevens continued his career in insurance until the end of his life. Quote, he says, "It gives a man character as a poet to have his daily contact with a job," end quote, he once said. A brilliant and unusual figure, he's now regarded as one of the most important poets of the 20th century. We'll turn to his poem of modern poetry, but before we get there, let's look at 784 quickly and the literary analysis topic. Poets combine rich language with poetic devices to develop a poem's theme or central message. The theme of these poems is poetry itself. What is it? What it does? What it means to people and societies? These are abstract ideas. To give them weight and shape, the poets use a variety of literary devices, including the following. Let's write these down in 2B. Imagery. We know this one already. Word pictures that appeal to the senses. Personification. A figure of speech in which a non-human idea or thing is given human qualities. Simile. A figure of speech comparing two seemingly different things and using the words like or as. As you read, compare how each poet draws on these tools to clothe abstract themes in tangible realities that readers can understand and feel. In the reading strategy here, the suggestion is to analyze philosophic arguments. We'll obviously get into that right away with Wallace Stevens of modern poetry. Also, by the way, do note that the vocabulary on 784, those 4 words, they will end up on the examination. All right, let's go to 786 and we'll look at the background information really quickly there. So you'll need this information in your notes. Work with me now. Wallace Stevens' poetry reflects the influence of the Symbolist literary movement. I would write that down. Of course, the great French poet Baudelaire is a classic example of the Symbolist movement. Originating in the last half of the 19th century, Symbolist poets believed that ideas and emotions are difficult to communicate because people perceive the world in such personal ways. These poets tried to convey meaning through symbols. So write that down. That's what symbolist means here. People, places, and objects that represent ideas beyond their concrete meanings. As a result, the work of symbolist poets like Stevens can often have many interpretations. So we now turn to Of Modern Poetry, Wallace Stevens' poem. Let's just follow along. We're going to listen to a professional reading of the poem. Just follow along again. Try and keep your pen or pencil tip following along with the words. Do your best to really focus. Here we go.
Of Modern Poetry by Wallace Stevens. The poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. It has not always had to find. The scene was set. It repeated what was in the script. Then the theater was changed to something else. Its past was a souvenir. It has to be living, to learn the speech of the place. It has to face the men of the time and to meet the women of the time. It has to think about war, and it has to find what will suffice. It has to construct a new stage. It has to be on that stage and, like an insatiable actor, slowly and with meditation, speak words that in the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens not to the play, but to itself, expressed in an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. The actor is a metaphysician in the dark, twanging an instrument, twanging a wiry string that gives sounds passing through sudden rightnesses, wholly containing the mind, below which it cannot descend, beyond which it has no will to rise. It must be the finding of a satisfaction, and maybe of a man skating, a woman dancing, a woman combing. The poem of the act of the mind.
Now, I've had students that say, this is a little more complicated poem than some of the others that we've been working with. So we want to kind of maybe sit up and take a couple of quick notes to help our way through this poem. It actually is not that difficult at the epidermal or the surface level, but certainly Stevens is playing some interesting philosophic games with us when he asks, what really is a poet? Especially a modern poet, right? First of all, let's just point out right away that we have a very interesting first line of this poem. The poem of the mind in the act of finding what will suffice. Notice this is not a full sentence. Write it in your notes at 2B. This is only a fragment, isn't it, right? We would expect for the poem to say, the poem of the mind is in the act of finding what will suffice. What is appropriate, in other words, right? When Stevens leaves out the verb is, he challenges the reader to put that verb in, and already Stevens is beginning to play games with us, asking what it is that is a poem. He says about the poem, it has not always had to find. Right? The scene was set. It repeated what was in the script. Let's just put it in our notes this way. This is why we began with those older poems. He says, there was a time when everybody knew what a poem was and everybody knew what a poem did. In the very earliest years, of course, that was Homer. That was the Iliad, that was the Odyssey. And then, of course, when Virgil, the great Roman poet, decided to write his poem, he simply looked at what Homer had done and said, I'll do it just like that. Of course, Dante will play the same game in his Divine Comedy, and of course, Milton will play the same game in Paradise Lost. That is to say, there was a time when everyone kind of knew what a poem was and what it was supposed to do. Of course, in the Renaissance, there's a break, but then after the Renaissance, everybody kind of accepts that's what poetry does. 14-line sonnet offerings, for example, and the like. What is Stevens saying about modern poetry? He is, of course, saying that something has changed. Notice the stanza break at line 4. Then, he says, the script was predictable. Then, the theater was changed to something else. Its past was a souvenir. Now, let's go ahead and point this out for your notes really quickly. In this poem, Stevens is going to bring together two different art forms, right? We've got poetry and we've got the stage. Now, of course, for the Greeks, there was no breaking up. When you study a Sophocles play, you are really studying powerful poetry that was presented on stage, right? So here we go. The modern poem is different from the old scripted, intentional, we might even say closed form, because the modern poem has to be living. It's an organic kind of entity. To learn the speech of the place, in other words, poetry and poets, Stevens says, have a much more difficult time because the readers of poetry are so radically changing in the modern age. It has to face the men of the time and to meet the women of the time. In other words, whereas before, Poetry was just kind of accepted as important because somebody said so, maybe a teacher, maybe an important person. Poetry is changing, he's pointing out. Poetry has to think about war, and it has to find what will suffice. Back to that word from the opening line. What does this mean, has to think about war? Well, quite literally, poetry was always somehow subsumed within the act of war and war making. We immediately think of the Iliad, the great song of war, Homer's Odyssey, the return from the war at the walls of Troy, and then of course Virgil's Aeneid, which is another song of war, right? And so he says poets still have to think about war, but the war maybe is going to be different here. That is to say, we could say maybe struggle. Poems have to construct, and poets have to construct a new stage. So let's go ahead and say it. Wallace Stevens is aware that modern poetry is building something new. It has to be on that stage and, like an insatiable actor, always looking to improve. Slowly and with meditation, speak words that in the ear, in the delicatest ear of the mind, repeat exactly that which it wants to hear, at the sound of which an invisible audience listens, not to the play, but to itself, expressed in an emotion as of two people, as of two emotions becoming one. Powerfully philosophic. Of course, if you're jotting down at 3A here, this is going to reference in some ways John Donne's Valediction Forbidding Mourning, a poem from an earlier time, the metaphysical poets of the late Renaissance in England. We'll study this poem in your senior year together. But the argument here that he makes is that the power of a great poem of modern poetry is that there's this dialectic or this tension that goes on between the script, whatever is going to be performed on stage, and the mind and the thoughts of the mind, and the powerful releasing of these emotions back and forth as the audience is listening. Of course, there seems to be a suggestion here as well that sometimes the audience is the actor himself, herself. To finish about the writer, the actor, the author. The actor is a metaphysician. I mentioned John Donne intentionally. In the dark, twanging an instrument, twanging a wiry string that gives sounds passing through sudden rightness, wholly containing the mind. We think here, of course, about the ways that Whitman will reference the soul in his Song of Myself. Below which it cannot descend, we think of Dante and his descent into Inferno. Beyond which it has no will to rise. In other words, Stevens is suggesting that poetry is now, modern poetry, seeking to tap something other than simply the war. You could make the argument, he's arguing, that modern poetry is not so much interested in the war as describing the war, but maybe asking the why of the war, the struggle. What is it that leads to the struggle that is going to be central to being human? Finally, another point. Poetry, to finish, must be the finding, or back to the word at the first line of the poem, of a satisfaction, some completeness. And maybe the poem of a man skating, a woman dancing, a woman combing. In other words, let's put it in our notes this way. Stevens says poetry, modern poetry, is often going to treat the most simple, the most mundane of activities. And there, the poem will be the act of the mind. Notice again in the final line, the poem of the act of the mind is not actually a sentence. Again, it's a fragment. Stevens intentionally trying to challenge our ideas of traditional poetry versus modern poetry. All right, let's jump really quickly to 2A to finish our annotations here. What are major messages or themes of this poem? Of course, the comparison between the old poems and the new kind of poetry, compelling as Stevens plays the game of juxtaposing on some level, maybe we would say, Homer versus Shakespeare, right? That idea that Shakespeare writes for a stage and compels then the audience to have to look inward. You could also make the observation that this is a major message of this poem as well, is that modern poetry is not just interested in high celebratory kinds of ideals like war, as the Iliad is, but rather modern poetry is about the inner workings of the most simple of activities. A woman combing her hair, a woman dancing, a man skating. Right. Let's jump to 2b really quickly. Of course, this is a somewhat complicated poem, made so because of these metaphors, these extended kinds of comparisons, especially this word order that we studied at the beginning and the very end of the poem without the verbs being present there. Stevens wants us to have to reread this poem multiple times to try and figure out exactly what he's saying about modern poetry. Of course, let's point out, he is writing a work of modern poetry to describe modern poetry. Do you got it? Do you understand? Right? He is writing a work of modern poetry to describe modern poetry. And the attempt to somehow capture the play, as he calls it, at line 16, of the mind. 3a, and relationships to other titles. Obviously here we are already thinking, as we said, about the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, those classic works of epic poetry, as well as, of course, the great poems of the Elizabethan Renaissance, Shakespeare's sonnets and the like. And of course, Walt Whitman's Song of Myself all comes to mind in terms of comparing. Of course, Wallace Stevens is a symbolist poet. We can think about the poetry of the great French symbolist poet Baudelaire. We can, of course, as well, think about any number of the Imagist poets as well, right? Finally, at 3b, let's ask this question. What is it in your relationship to poetry that is significant? Why, for example, do you resonate with some poems and not with other poems? For example, I'll just give you an example of this. Some students have said that they really resonate with that poem about old age sticks in E.E. Cummings' poem, but this poem, they seem somewhat lost to it. Why is that? What is it about